God, we are thankful for another Sabbath day that we can converse with each other through this magnificent technology. We are thankful for Dr. Chartier, who's going to share with us from one of his many books. We are mindful that universities are schools of character as much as anything else, and they may produce virtuous people or vicious people, or some combination of both. But they have an impact on the character formation of their students and faculty and staff. Keeping that in mind, we're a little alarmed at the prospect of Adventist higher education at the moment. We pray for wisdom and courage and perseverance as we move through this difficult time. It has always been a difficult time to have an Adventist university, but seems so especially now. Help us to learn from Gary this morning, I pray in Christ's name, amen. Welcome to everybody. Good morning to those of us in California or nearby, and good evening to those in Europe, and good day, I think, to those who are in Australia. We are glad to be together, and we are glad that Dr. Chartier is with us. He is the Distinguished Professor of Law and Business Ethics at La Sierra University, where he also serves as the Associate Dean for the Tom and Vi Zapara School of Business. A magnificent building on the west side of the entrance to the campus. It's making a very strong contribution, not only with the building, but with its faculty and its leadership. Now, we know Gary from times of old, and we have benefited from him. He was reared in La Sierra, and I think I may have first met him when he was in secondary school at La Sierra, though I'm not quite sure of that. But then he went to college there and studied some at Claremont, went to Cambridge and earned a PhD in Cambridge, and then went to UCLA and earned a law degree. So he is both a philosopher and a lawyer by training, and brings those skills to us. He has also written many, many books and articles, and this one that we are looking at is one of his most recent ones. I say one of his most recent ones because he has recently had word that his book on friendship is in the process of being published by Fortress Press, and that is very, very good news. That manuscript has been in the making for quite a while, and I'm glad to see that it's going to be available to more people. So Gary is also the recipient of a degree of that's given very, very rarely to people, not as an honorary degree, but as a recognition of their accomplishments after having received their doctorates. And these are given out very rarely, and very few, if any, other than Gary, have received it who are Americans. So we are in the midst of greatness here. I think I'll pause and say something that I've often said, and that is, we have the privilege of being in the company of great people, and we often take each other for granted. And Gary Chartier is one of those truly great people, and we need to be appreciative of that. In addition to all of that, Gary is a great friend. If he's your friend, you are a very lucky person. So, we hear from him today about the university, and I'd like to begin by asking him a few more general questions, unless you'd like to make a statement first, Gary. Do you want to say something at the outset, or should I just jump into my questions?
I'd love for you to dive into your questions about the first portion of this book, Dave, or the whole book, if you prefer.
Okay, just a word. We'll take one chapter a week and work our way through this book. It's 6 chapters. We won't do them in 6 successive weeks, but we'll run 2 or 3 series concurrently, and that way we can move back and forth between these different topics. I'd like to begin with some very general questions, Gary, if I may, and that is, As you look upon the university life in general, that is tertiary education in general, before COVID-19 and after COVID-19, what do you see? I'm not now talking merely about Seventh-day Adventist universities, but higher education in general, let's say in this country. I have seen quite a few things on the internet about the impact of COVID-19 that were done during the last year, but very few of them, I think I found one that is discussing the situation now that we are in, some say, the post-COVID era. Now, I'm a little suspicious about talking about the post-COVID era, but some people are talking about things in that way. So, Dr. Chartier, as you look at the world of tertiary education in the United States, what do you see?
Well, it's flattering to be asked the question because the question implies that I might actually know how to answer the question. I'm not sure I do. I think that my own sense is that look, we've had a year plus during which institutions have experimented in lots of ways with either hybrid or more commonly fully online delivery mechanisms for a range of programs, and things that have been done exclusively in the past by institutions that have been, often viewed by others as, providing less than high quality products, have now been done by, the very finest institutions around the world. And I cannot imagine that we're not going to see a real shift to mixed delivery modes for all sorts of institutions. And I think that's going, because the experimentation has revealed what works and what doesn't. Now, I think we all know from our own experience, either as teachers or students, that lots of people are not very adept at delivering online curricula. Lots of institutions and lots of individuals are not very adept at doing that. And even when that is the case, of course, there are, I think we recognize, real limits to what those can offer. On the other hand, there clearly is a subset of students for whom those kinds of online experiences offer dramatic improvements as regards convenience. People who, because of geography or because of work schedules, really might find it much harder to take advantage of traditional programs. Nonetheless, may discover that, that virtual programs or programs that include virtual components make their lives a lot easier. And I suppose they'll want to stick with them. On the other hand, however, I think many students are deeply distressed by the absence of human contact that many of them have experienced in recent years. And I expect that there will be a tremendous amount of pent-up demand for in-person programs this fall. I think that institutions that plan on reduced student numbers are going to be startled and perhaps in some ways overwhelmed. So that's one thing I think we might reasonably expect to see. But I do think that at the same time, we're going to see some institutions finding that if their in-person programs don't really offer something of distinctive value, they may well be overwhelmed by, in some ways, more convenient and less expensive virtual ones. So there's going to be a lot of demand for in-person provision, it seems to me. At the same time, there's going to be real pressure to ensure that that in-person provision offers something of real value. I'm not sure that I have more insight. I'm not sure any of that was insightful, but that's as much as I have to say about this.
Well, it is surprising to me and good news to me that some institutions may be surprised by how startled, I think was the word you used, and maybe even overwhelmed by the number of students who want to return to campus. That's actually good news, I think, both for them and for the institution. Now, the same question as you look at Adventist tertiary education. Some of our institutions were struggling before COVID-19, and some, I suppose, were wounded by COVID-19. Do you see let me ask it the other way. What do you see in the future for Adventist tertiary education in view of COVID?
Well, so the general observations I tried to make a moment ago still seem to me applicable in the case of Adventism. I do think that given the concern that many families have had over the years for Adventist higher education as a means of acculturation, means that for those families that continue to regard that as important, the on campus and therefore in person immersive educational experience seems likely to appear especially important. And so for those families, then there will be real reason to press for returns to campus experiences. Um, Beyond that, though, I don't know what else, I'm not sure what else to add, except that I wonder whether some institutions with limited reserves will find that it may be hard for them to, kind of maintain their programs, maintain their offerings at this point. And so even if there is a long-term prospect of real intense interest in on-campus delivery, I think we may find some of the weaker Adventist institutions struggling there. It's worth being reminded, as I had to remind myself when doing this book, that there are now about 150 higher educational institutions in the Adventist universe around the world today. So it's hard to generalize about those, but I do suspect that the last year will have been hard for some of them to ride out, and I suspect we will see some, kind of at the lower end of the financial viability ladder, perhaps closing up shop. But I think those that can survive will definitely benefit from not only the general trend that I noted a moment ago, but also the fact in particular that Adventist families who value immersive educational experiences will press for on-campus experiences for their students.
How do things look at La Sierra?
I think it's a little early to say. I definitely believe that we will benefit from the pent-up demand that I referred to earlier, but I don't have hard numbers to point to.
Okay. So why did you write this book?
I wrote this book, Dave, because Adventist higher education has fascinated me and enriched my life for decades, right? So I think I found myself stimulated and liberated as a student at La Sierra in the 80s, and found myself relishing the educational experience, the intellectually stimulating engagement that I was having there. And I began thinking back then about kind of broadly theological and philosophical issues related to the nature of higher education as a participant in student government, and as a result, also a participant in university governance. I certainly thought a great deal at the time about, how the institution that I was participating in worked and what might matter there. So I was fascinated by all of this. I was liberated because I think the intellectual resources that I was offered helped me to, step into a wider world probably than I had occupied as an adolescent in secondary school. And so I began thinking about this, actually proposed an honors thesis that I ended up not writing for reasons that need to detain us now, that would have kind of paralleled what's now the first chapter of this book. So these are issues that really have preoccupied me for a long time. During the period of relative isolation that I, like many other people, experienced in the last year, I decided it was finally time to write the book. I could draw on that earlier thinking, draw on some work that I'd done for the Journal of Adventist Education in the early 90s about student life, but I really just wanted to think hard about what a positive vision of Adventist higher education might look like and how one might defend the elements of that vision as we move forward. I was excited. I was grateful for what Adventist higher education had given me. And I wanted, the next generation of faculty members and staff members and students to be able to enjoy a genuinely positive experience in the context of the Adventist higher educational system.
Do you think of your book as continuing what Adventists have thought about this over the years, or as challenging what Adventists have thought, or in some way being a revolutionary alternative to what Adventists have thought about higher education?
Well, I suspect I'm hesitant in talking about Adventists or anybody else to suppose that there is anything like a kind of uniform position to which I'm reacting, or a uniform position that I'm seeking to continue. I mean, I certainly learned a great deal from the thinking of people like F.E.J. Harter. As I mentioned in the acknowledgement section of the book, Harter had written a kind of an essay in the philosophy of Adventist education that was at some points available as a separately published booklet, at some point I think as a piece of the church manual that I found really insightful, and certainly liked a great deal of what was there. I remember reading that as a college student. I think certainly in a lot of ways, I was, as I wrote the book, probably, I hope continuing the tradition that people like Harter, and, certainly a number of people over the years at La Sierra, my teachers and interlocutors had contributed to. On the other hand, probably there are ways in which I, have tried to push the envelope a bit more. So, I think in some, there are certainly some things that some participants, longtime participants, in the Adventist higher educational world might find puzzling or unfamiliar. I think it's a bit of a mix. I certainly don't intend any of this to be shocking or overwhelming, but at the same time, I do hope that it's all helpful and that some of it's provocative.
So if somebody put the book Education on the table by Ellen White, and then your book, The Idea of an Adventist University, and opened them up and read from both of them, what would they likely notice?
Well, of course, Education is not a book about higher education in particular, and it's certainly not a book about the university. It probably also reflects, some concerns from an earlier era that, might, make a number of us, raise questions. In particular, my book, and this is not particularly a comment on Ellen White, but it is a comment, I think, about the sort of educational environment within which the book Education emerged. One thing that is really important for me to argue for here is a move beyond paternalism and in loco parentis as regards, how institutions treat students. And I do think that's been a really pervasive feature of the, some aspects of the Adventist educational tradition. On the other hand, I don't think that that's very compatible with the best thing in education, that wonderful call at the beginning that, the want of the world is the want of men. And, we can, I hope, move beyond the sex and gender specificity there to say that it's the want of people who exhibit a kind of both intellectual vigor and moral integrity that allow them to make a difference. And of course, empowering students certainly is one way to help them become those sorts of people. So again, I think people would find some things that were compatible and familiar, and some things perhaps that pushed the envelope.
Okay, so, but why a university? We're a small denomination, only 20 million people around the world, which is not very big. That's pretty small. And yet we have all these institutions. I think you said 150?
That's roughly the number that I turned up when I wrote this, yeah.
That's an enormous investment. What about some other models? For instance, the so-called Mormon model, where they create small institutions next door to large institutions and don't really offer academic programs, but they offer support and wisdom and companionship for people who are in the Mormon community. What if we had, is there any merit in going that direction rather than the direction we've gone?
Yeah, so I would suggest that there is, and I think there are a couple of issues that are relevant there. But first, I'll say, the point of this book was not to argue that there had to be universities, but only that if there were, here's how we ought to think about them, right? So I'm not really, focusing as much on the question that you just posed, but I do hope some things I say in the book are relevant to it. So I think the most important thing to say is that Mormon model that you describe is one in which, so first of all, there's not a lot of institutional pluralism. So that while there are a few other Mormon institutions of higher education, basically there's BYU. And so BYU is very, it's there in Salt Lake, and it's therefore under the scrutiny of the Mormon, church governance structure. And, it becomes much easier to operate that institution in a way that narrows the range of things that can reasonably be said there. So I think having a broad, having a pluralistic institutional environment, then by contrast ensures that a variety of voices are heard and a variety of experiments engaged in, and a single, sort of ideological profile can't be imposed on everybody. Also, I think the Mormon model assumes that what higher educational institutions are mainly good for is something like undergraduate education. And so if the thought is that we're interested in undergraduate education, then we can certainly supplement the experience of students. We can help them feel connected. We can help them wrestle with issues of faith through these kinds of supplementary structures of the kinds the Mormons have created. But I want to suggest that one of the most crucial things that a higher educational system does, and it really does it as a system, as a kind of overall ecology of institutions, is that it provides opportunities for the Adventist community to think through issues that matter. And it's a place where the church can do important kinds of thinking. It's not the only place. There can certainly be intellectually serious activities that happen outside those institutional contexts. And I certainly don't want to suggest that, this is the only place where they happen. But I think the church wouldn't get the benefit of that kind of thinking if it simply relied on Adventist equivalents of the LDS houses of religion. So I think that matters. I also think that the institutional environments provide connections between the church and an important subset of members who might otherwise end up disconnected from the church. That a whole range of people, either because they are themselves institutional employees or because they appreciate the kinds of opportunities that are offered in tandem with institutional life, stay connected to the church through universities and colleges when they might otherwise end up disconnected. They wouldn't have institutional homes, and so to the extent that it matters to the church to stay connected with those people, then I think it matters to maintain those institutional environments. So I think there's several things we can say there. Then the Mormon model, I think, is probably insufficient because of its lack of pluralism. Institutions offer places where the church can do its thinking, and of course that also means where the church can contribute to the wider world through the scholarship of its faculty members, but it also means those faculty members contribute to the church's own thinking, and the institutions provide ways of keeping employees and others more closely connected to the life of the church.
Okay, that leads me to two more questions before we turn to the book specifically. And that the first one is, we have sort of experienced mission creep with respect to our higher education endeavors. And that is, I think these institutions were established to prepare people primarily for denominational service. And now we offer a wide range of possibilities and expect only a minority of people to go into denominational service. Have we overextended ourselves in your judgment?
Well, if what we're trying to do is contribute to the formation of students, and so even just ignoring the issue of the contribution that institutions make to the thought of the church and the wider world, we just think about the education of students, it hardly seems to me as if the only students we want to influence, the only students we want to enrich, are students who are planning on working for the church. We certainly also, I think, don't want it to be the case that most Adventists work for the church. So if we don't want that, if we do want Adventist members in each generation doing a variety of things, then it seems odd that we wouldn't want to contribute, if we can, to their development as whole persons as they prepare to do those various things.
Okay, so thank you. There's a difference between a college and a university, I take it, although many colleges are not calling themselves universities. How would you describe that difference? And do you really think Adventists should be engaged in the lives of universities as distinguished from undergraduate colleges? Do we have the resources to create major research universities? Parenthetically, I was happy this week to read Richard Hamill's memoirs called Pilgrimage.
Yes.
And it's a very interesting book. I learned that there was serious consideration to having one university, namely at Loma Linda, and the seminary moving to Loma Linda. I had heard people talk about that in general ways in terms of what if, but actually there were serious considerations given to that possibility. One committee looking at that, another committee looking at the possibility of a university in the Midwest or East. But Richard Hamill is very committed, or was very committed, to the idea of a research university. And he makes that case again and again in his book. And he said he made that case again and again to church leaders and to constituents at churches, congregations, and camp meetings, and so forth. Now, that's an enormous challenge to become a research university. And I sometimes said to myself, that's too big of a challenge for us to take on. Let's do first-rate undergraduate education, maybe to the master's level, but let's not get involved in doctoral degrees because that's so expensive and so demanding. What are your reflections about that?
Yeah, so readers of the book will find that I talk at some length about graduate education, and particularly doctoral level education, in chapter 2 of the book. So we'll have occasion to come back to that, I think, a bit. Roughly speaking, I would say that as regards academic doctorates, as over against professional doctorates like the ones in medicine and dentistry, I think we should be very careful about what we do. And we'll come back to this, I hope, that, when we discuss chapter 2. But I think it seems to me, for a whole host of reasons, we should be very, very limited as regards what we do at the doctoral level. I think we should do some doctoral programs. We should do doctoral programs in those areas in which nobody else is likely to be able to do what we do as well. I think there's no real point in doing something that somebody can benefit from at another institution at a comparable level. particularly because I think it's unfair to students to enroll them in programs from which they're unlikely to find employment. Right. So, if we started to offer, let's say, PhD programs in 19th century, English literature, I think we would be doing our students a profound disservice. On the other hand, I think there's probably something really valuable about doing work of the kind that, George Knight and his students have been doing for years in Adventist history, because I think nobody else is probably going to do that work. And so, and I think we can probably do it to a high standard. As regards the more general issue of university versus college, as I suggest in the introduction to the book, I think it would be a mistake to draw sharp distinctions here. We can think about a sort of ideal type of the undergraduate college that only does undergraduate teaching and nothing else. On the other hand, we can think about the ideal type of research university that has many, many research doctoral programs and really emphasizes graduate teaching and research. But then in reality, there's a whole host of institutional forms spread out on a continuum between those two. Right. So you might consider, for instance, a place like Pomona College in Claremont, which is committed to being a research college. Right. So it's offering high quality undergraduate education, but at the same time, teaching is being done by faculty members who are making very active contributions to intellectual life. On the other hand, you can think about university models like the Cal States, that our universities have graduate programs, at least in education, have begun to offer even some doctoral programs, but really have seen themselves primarily as teaching institutions and have, not placed great emphasis on research. So, the categories college and university are messy, and I don't want to place undue weight on the language we use. But I suggest in the introduction to the book, for those who haven't had a chance to see that I think there are maybe 4 things that are going on when we talk about university that are worth underscoring in this connection. Right. So universities are places that take research seriously. And as I've suggested, I think taking research seriously is a way in which institutions contribute to the life of the church and to the life of the wider society. And so it matters for both reasons. The term university conveys the sense that an institution is involved to a meaningful degree in the delivery of post-baccalaureate programs. And, again, here virtually at Loma Linda, we understand the value in a number of areas of doing that in everything from pharmacy to the allied health professions to public health to medicine to dentistry and so forth. But, clearly in some other areas, we may think that there is some value in doing something, at least at the master's level, even if we restrain ourselves from moving into to doctoral programs. So this, is certainly not unique to universities. You do find this in some colleges, but I just think it's an important thing I want to underscore as part of the reason I'm emphasizing the word university in the title. University educates students as reflective, contributing members of their communities and seeks to enrich their understanding and experience in ways that help them to develop as human beings and as societal leaders. And then this is a point that I've tried to make in this conversation already with respect to the church, that over the past 150 years or so, the university as an institution has developed, I think, a distinctive role as a resource for societal innovation, as a place on the cutting edge of growth for the various communities it serves. So I don't think that those are somehow exclusive of colleges. We can find colleges that have those characteristics, but I focus on universities because universities, I think, especially have those features.
Thank you. I have not read all the way through John Henry Newman's The Idea of a University, and yet I was impressed at the outset by how much emphasis he puts upon education as the primary role of the university as opposed to research and service. So I was a little startled by that. And I'm not quite sure what he would say in our own time about that, but he himself thought the education of students was primary, was paramount. Okay, anything else from the introduction that we should touch on before we go to chapter 1?
So just to respond to one comment from Simona in the chat, doctorate in 19th century English literature gives people more chances for employment than a doctorate in Adventist history. Yeah, so. But I'm not, that might well be. We'd have to think a little more about that. But I think my point is not that doctorates in English literature aren't marvelous. I'm somebody who did a doctorate in theology. I just think that a doctorate in English literature from an Adventist institution is unlikely to give people more opportunities for employment, because there are already lots and lots of doctoral programs in English literature. And for an Adventist institution to dive into the task of trying to offer that and to compete with all those other institutions at placing students seems to me to be a tremendous challenge.
Okay. Simona, do you want to reply to that? Apparently not. Okay. Turning then to chapter 1, sort of like Karl Barth, you have a summary of the chapter at the top, at the very beginning, and I was struck by the verbs that you use in this, and I would like to read them here because they're powerful. I think there are 6 of them, all right? An Adventist University, 1, celebrates God's creative activity. 2, participates in God's providence. 3, recognizes the reality of sin. 4, contributes to God's saving and prophetic work in history. 5, welcomes Sabbath rest. 6, embraces and seeks to embody God's love. And 7, not 6, but 7, fosters the search for truth, all of which is God's. Now, do you want to say anything about that major summary of your chapter?
Well, I guess only that I think it's really important to recognize that for all of its sometimes seemingly prosaic quality, Adventist higher education can and should be understood in the context of a rich kind of grasp of Adventist theology more broadly, and that situating the university theologically helps us to see how it fits into, how it participates in the mission of the church.
Okay, so chapter 1 is a theology of higher education, and I'd like to go through and just ask you about each of these major sections and ask you to comment on them. And then I have some particular paragraphs I'd like to hear from you about.
Sure.
Excuse me. Theme number 1, creation. What do you want to say about that?
What do I want to say about it?
Yes.
Sorry, I thought perhaps you were going to ask more specific questions. So, not everything that matters is created, but everything that's created matters. And creation provides the broad context within which it seems to me the Adventist higher educational enterprise happens. And so the idea, it seems to me, is that we participate in trying to understand what is at root a good creation, and that doing that with a focus on, again, anything from silt to symphonies, as Nicholas Lash says somewhere, all of that's part of creation. And creation, I think, provides the basic mandate for the basic grounding for what we might want to say as participants in the work of Adventist higher education.
I was interested that the word creation applies not only to what we might call the natural world, but also to the products of human inventiveness. So you have a kind of expanded doctrine of creation, I think.
Well, I think a pretty standardly orthodox one, right? God is the creator of everything. And to talk about God as creator, we're part of the natural world. It's not as if what we do is somehow separate from the natural world. So,
but skyscrapers are part of God's creation, as are subway trains and so forth.
Absolutely, because we do them and we're part of creation, and God creates in and through what we do.
Reminds me of Roy Branson's comment that walking down the streets in New York City was as good, and looking at the skyscrapers is as good as walking in the Grand Canyon. Now,
I'm with Roy on that, but yeah.
Pardon me? Okay, the next theme that you bring up is the image of God. Again, we're looking at different theological themes that have an impact on Adventist higher education. Image of God.
Yeah. So to say that we are made in the image of God, again, might remind us of that great bit in education that we reflected on earlier about the power to think and to do, and the idea that all of creation, of course, ultimately in one important respect reflects God's image, but we at any rate are aware or can be aware that we do. And so embracing this power to think and to do and to encourage its encourage its nurture and nourishment on the part of students and faculty members alike provides an important basis for both intellectual activity on the one hand in the university and moral formation and formation as possessors of independent judgment, it seems to me as well. So to talk about the image of God is certainly, I think, to affirm a high view of humanness that ought to inform how we think about the educational task.
Okay, embodiment.
Yeah, so bodies matter. And that means, in turn, it seems to me that it's a good thing for education, and so for Adventist education, and so for Adventist higher education, to be concerned with, as I say here, all the things that sustain our embodied lives and understand and enable our understanding and appreciation of embodiment. And so, that can mean everything from, from medical care and education and the life sciences, but it certainly includes other things from clothing design to environmental science to history, which concerns embodied activity and so forth. So recognizing that we are embodied and the value of embodiment again helps to underscore the broad range of things with which it is not only sort of, as it were, permissible but positively good for education to be concerned with.
Okay, the next one I have here is providence. And I would like to read a little bit from this. You say God's providential activity is activity in and through the behavior of God's human and non-human creatures, which means that we are participants in this activity. So God is active in all of the lives of all the creatures. But then you go on to say, to believe in providence is to believe that God is present and active in the world in particular ways, responsive to individual choices, sensitive to individual circumstances. God is not the absent landlord of deism, content to act by establishing general laws, or the impersonal, if unified, whole of pantheism. Instead, God inspires and prompts and guides in order to achieve divine purposes in response to individual situations. So here we are into the issue of SDA, right? In this case, we're not talking about Seventh-day Adventists, but we're talking about special divine activity. And that's two things. And I know you'll probably have a book just on this, but what does one mean by special divine activity? And two, how does one discern it?
Yeah, so what one means by special divine activity, I take it, is divine activity that intends to realize particular purposes that is, that are reflective of the specific circumstances of creatures. We could spend a great deal of time, obviously, talking about what the underlying metaphysics of that view might be, and different ways, obviously, of working that out. But I think it's just a kind of to believe that kind of activity is real is, it seems to me, just a consequence of the belief that God is personal and so has specific purposes, and that God is present everywhere and at all moments and all districts of reality and so forth. As I go on to say, we absolutely need to recognize that activity as constrained and mediated, and so as not somehow occurring without sort of any kind of constraint, because otherwise we would have no way to understand the reality of evil in the world. So we can come back to that. That's something I've talked with this group about before. As regards how we discern that, I think the discernment, I don't think that as a general matter, I don't think we should expect to be able to discern such things in the moment. Now, maybe we can sometimes, but I think, you're really talking about, much of the time, let's say with overall historical trends, either in a particular individual life or in, say, the life of a culture, you can imagine a kind of gentle pressure in a certain direction overall resulting in a discernible pattern, which one can reasonably identify as the work of providence in light of the overall picture of God as good, God as love, that we might want to endorse. And I think I say something about that somewhere here, say talking, for instance, about the movement toward the abolition of slavery as something that perhaps at the time, certainly in retrospect, we can see that way. And I think we can imagine a kind of parallel in individual lives, but I don't think it's a matter of saying there's some particular sort of tag that gets worn by a development in my life that allows me in the moment to say this is the work of providence. Rather, it's a matter of saying I know the kind of God is, and when I look back and see a pattern, I can associate that with divine activity. So I think we need to be humble in this regard. It's not a kind of way of bypassing the critical work of just trying to make sense of the realities in our lives and saying, well, there's providence, so now we know what God's up to in the world and everything's sorted out.
Okay, you may want to defer your response to this next question because it's really oblique to what we're talking about. But okay. I wonder about the relationship between providence, divine providence on the one hand, and intercessory prayer on the other. Do you want to touch base on that, or should we keep moving?
Well, so so intercessory prayer, it seems to me, poses a whole separate set of issues, right? Because with respect to intercessory prayer, I mean, there's first of all the challenge of whether the thing that I want God to do when I pray is a thing that it will turn out, even if God might intend that it occur, that can in fact be brought about given the relevant constraints with which providence has to do. But then there's the separate issue of why providence should be exercised this way in response to intercessory prayer, right? So, I mean, if I pray, please heal Dave's lung cancer, there seems to be something problematic about the idea that God needs to wait for me to pray that in order to work to heal Dave's lung cancer. And exactly. So I think we need to be very concerned about that. I think that if we want to offer an account of things in accordance with which intercessory prayer isn't simply superfluous and doesn't just involve a kind of solidarity with God, let's say, and concern about such matters, then the way to do that, and we're not going to sort this out today, and I'd want to ask people to do some reading before we talk more about it. I think we'd have to do so in light of the notion, which I'm not saying I can defend here, but I think I'm just saying that only if some such notion can be defended, I think, can we make sense of intercession as something that actually contributes to the outcome of things in the world. You'd have to do so in light of the the view that there are deep interconnections between persons that intercession in some way opens up to providence. We might see this worked out there are a couple of places where, that I'm aware of where this kind of thing has been explored. It's there very briefly, I think, in Marjorie Sohoki's fine book, In God's Presence, a nice, which is probably the single best book about prayer generally that I know. The English philosopher of religion and actually John Hick's doctoral advisor, H. Price, has a little book called Essays in the Philosophy of Religion. And he's got a chapter there about petitionary prayer. So petition more generally, for oneself as well as intercession for others, that offers an interesting hypothesis related to this. So I'd say those are perhaps worth exploring. I think something like that is probably required to make sense of the notion of intercession.
Well, I'm happy you said that, because I heard myself saying to someone this past week who's facing major medical challenges that I would pray for this person, even though I didn't understand promissory prayer. And I said, I can't imagine God will do more for you because I asked than God would do for you if I hadn't asked.
Right.
And yet, there is something to intercessory prayer that I don't quite understand. So I'm going to pray for you nevertheless. And the person responded quite favorably, quite positively to that. So, yeah, I also like this gentle pressure in a certain direction, and the idea that providence is to be seen over the course of a lifetime or the lifetime of a civilization rather than an individual, rather than a specific thing. I'm thinking of the Branson study where they try to determine if people who were prayed for did better after some kind of surgery. And the answer was no, except that those who knew they were being prayed for perhaps did a little worse than those who didn't know they were being prayed for. But it seems to me that the idea of having prayer measured by what it does on a specific occasion for a specific issue for a specific person is different than talking about what it does over the course of a lifetime or over the course of the lifetime of a civilization. Exercise doesn't do much good if one does it once, but if one has a pattern of exercise, I do think that matters. Okay, the next one, Sabbath.
Sure. So I think I'm going to just a second here. I'm just dropping into the chat the links to pages for the two volumes that I mentioned. So give me just a second to finish that.
Okay, so this is a reference to the book Presence, God's Presence, Theological Reflections. And the second one is what?
So it's H. Price, Essays in the Philosophy of Religion.
Okay.
And so it's specifically then the chapter of that book that's concerned with petitionary prayer that I think is
okay.
Anyway,
Thank you for those.
So with respect to Sabbath, several things we might want to note here that are germane to the life of an Adventist university. So first of all, we can, I think, see in Sabbath an affirmation, as I suggest here, of the idea of freedom, right? So that there are demands that other people or perhaps our own, Puritan consciences might make on us. And so Sabbath is a way, I suggest, of saying no to the demand that we demonstrate how productive we are in order to shore up our value as persons. So I think that's one thing that's going on when we celebrate by resting. And so, the point here, of course, is not that it doesn't matter whether we do things, but it's okay to not allow our sense of self to be caught up with that. And so that matters in terms of the immediate day-to-day practice of an Adventist institution. It should encourage this by encouraging people not to feel they need to work 7-day work weeks. But at the same time, it also matters on another level, I suggest, because it cuts against the grain of a view of higher education in accordance with which higher education has to be useful in some way. It has to produce tangible results that are independent of the simple, straightforward business of education.
or of research. And so to recognize the Sabbath's protest there then is also at the same time, I think, to recognize the importance of not allowing education to be subjected to the demands of utilitarian usefulness. So in addition, to talk about Sabbath is to talk about the goodness of creation. So to to celebrate the Sabbath is to go back to affirm the goodness of creation, and therefore what I've already said about the way in which that goodness provides a basis for the wide-ranging exploration in which the Adventist University should
Well,
engage.
keeping one eye on the time, I'm going to have to move more swiftly. I do want to pause, though, on this idea of sin. Why should sin be part of the Adventist theology of higher education?
Well, so I think one reason it should matter, and there's several reasons. So certainly we need to be aware of the impact of sin, and one of the things that it seems to me the the research and the teaching of an Adventist university can do is to is to just not undermine, but to challenge the negative consequences of sin. Another thing that might matters is that to recognize the reality of sin is to recognize the importance of institutional processes that minimize the negative effects of sin, right? So the idea here, and I'm not claiming originality for any of this. Think about David Hume himself, of course, not a religious person, but I think very wise in many respects. So there's a Humean point that we design institutions not on the assumption that the people who will exercise power are super virtuous, but on the assumption that they're not. So that, we have institutions that don't allow for certain kinds of abuses to take place. We have institutions that allow for the free exchange of ideas precisely because we don't want somebody in the name of virtue shutting down discussion when in fact that may really be an excuse for something self-serving. And so we want to think about sin then both because we want to try to remedy it with some of the work that we do, remedy its effects, but also because we want an institution that protects growth, development, the free exchange of ideas, and so forth, and protects autonomous decision making in the face of the sinful temptation to exercise power.
Okay, I'm going to just read some of these other topics and then focus on one. You have Jesus Christ, then the Logos, salvation, prophecy. You want to say a word about prophecy?
Sure. So an Adventist institution, I suggest, should be a prophetic institution. So one of the friends who reviewed this manuscript and ended up graciously providing a blurb was concerned that I hadn't said anything about prophecy in this chapter. And I think that friend probably had in mind, first and foremost, that I hadn't perhaps said enough about the distinctive Adventist history with Ellen White. But I do think, and I don't want to second guess that person, I do think that more broadly, the prophetic record, of course, is an important part of the Hebrew Bible, and the prophetic task is one of ongoing importance. As we see, for instance, when we think about the way in which prophecy looks to the New Testament writers, Paul's very much aware that prophets ought to try to correct each other. To talk about prophetic language, at least if we're talking about the way prophetic talk is used in the New Testament, probably also in the Old, in the Hebrew Bible, but certainly in the New Testament, talk about prophecy certainly doesn't imply some sort of infallible ability to speak for God. But I think the church
should be prophetic in the way in which, for instance, Jack Pravancha talked about the church as a prophetic minority. And the idea is, not that it's somehow infallible, but that it's speaking powerfully and provocatively to the wider culture. And I suggest that Adventist higher education can be prophetic in a number of different ways here. It can contribute to the church's prophetic ministry through the substance of the things it says, through its scholars, the things that go on in its classrooms. And also, and this is a point that I make, I come back to in multiple points through the book, through the kind of life that the university embraces, the kind of community it fosters. And that can be, I think, powerfully reflective of prophetic witness to the world.
All right. So then you go to trust, hope, love, and truth. I'd like to end my inquiries of you with this notion of truth, and that you say it is important to distinguish the realization that this is the case, that is, that we are fallible, finite, and sinful, and so forth. It is important to distinguish the realization that this is the case from any sort of skepticism or relativism. Our beliefs need correction precisely because in God there is such a thing as truth, how God knows things to be. There really is a difference between appearance and reality, between supposition and reality, between hypothesis and reality, between convention and reality. At the same time, there's an unbridgeable gap between all that God knows and all that we could know or do know. Well, now, how does all that fit in with perspectivalism and social location of knowledge and so forth?
Yeah, so it seems to me that our only access to truth is through the resources that we have, right? So the important thing to emphasize here is that none of us has unqualified, untrammeled access to truth. And so that recognition is absolutely vital, that any attempt to find truth on the part of the university has to begin with the recognition that because we're not God, there are profound limitations to what we know and what we can know. At the same time, and so the what's right about concern with perspective and social location is that the only access we have to truth is our access. It comes through who we are. At the same time, what we shouldn't do is use that, I think, as an excuse for intellectual laziness or as an excuse for just giving up on the possibility that our views can be corrected, that our views can be challenged, that our views might well be profoundly wrong. So the only reason we keep fighting about these matters is because the only good reason is if we recognize that we can do better, that we can understand more fully. And so we should absolutely recognize the limitations that we confront, but those are limitations on our attempt to find what's actually the case. We don't want to take, perhaps we do want to take the view. There's a lovely little bit that the sadly now deceased Harvard philosopher Hilary Putnam offers somewhere. Yeah, man, I know where you're coming from, man, but relativism just isn't true for me. And I think that's right. Things aren't just true for us. That doesn't mean that we might not have particular reasons to believe things that other people might not. We might be in a particular epistemic situation that is different from those of other people, and that's fine. We absolutely have to recognize the states of affairs that give rise to concerns about relativity and perspective. We have to recognize that what we're always trying to do is to move beyond those to the most adequate possible understanding of a reality that really does transcend our perspectives.
Okay, it's time for us to take a break. Thank you very much. I noticed Simona has a question about intellectual freedom, academic freedom, and you do discuss this in detail later on, but maybe you can say a word or two about it today. And also, I'd like to hear what you think the expression present truth means. So maybe we can start with those questions after the break.
Sure.
It's about 11:41 here in California, so let's begin about 11:51 and take a 10-minute break, and then we will have some questions and answers for Gary. If you have a question or a comment for Gary, please let Forrest Howe know, and he will establish the sequence of speakers. Thank you, Gary. We will see you and everybody else in about 10 minutes.
Hey, yeah, the best thing is if you can raise your little yellow hand from your position there. If you can't, keep waving and hopefully I'll see it. But I'm developing a cue right now that we will get to immediately following our break.
Forrest, McKinley, how do you raise your hand in this thing?
McKinley, I'll put you down.
It goes to reactions, and then in reactions you have raise hand.
Reactions. Oh, in reactions. Okay, let's see here.
There is a whole button that says raise hand.
Raise hand. I don't see. Oh,
At
okay,
the
I see
bottom,
that.
at the
Okay,
bottom
I
of
see
it.
that. All right. Thank you very much. All right. Anyway, Forrest, I don't know that I have a comment, but just in case.
Okay, now you know where your hand is.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you again.
For helping with that.
Thank you, Simona.
By the way, Gary,
Yes.
I saw a couple of cat ears in your screen there for a little bit. I want you to know that cats have a dispensation to photobomb at any time. So,
Well, that's good. That's good to know. I'm very happy for the that particular feline member of our household to show up on screen. The challenge is when she's also on the keyboard.
yeah, I understand. And my cat shows up a few times too. So,
Yeah.
but you're right, it messes up the keyboard.
Yeah, I think it killed a couple of different things Alicia was doing yesterday. I know on her computer, so can be a bit
Yeah.
of.
Well, anyway, all right. We just give a few more minutes here.
Sure.
Are there other questions that people have? Just raise your hand. Dr. Bull, I see you now.
By the way, Gary, you should get your cat back.
I suspect she will come back whether I do anything about it or not. She likes to wander by when I'm sitting at the keyboard, so I'm confident we'll see her again.
Well, Gary, the big thing that we're finding out here is our cat likes printers. And I think I'm going to get her paw up in the rollers sooner or later because she'll come flying from across the house to get to one of our printers.
When it's in operation or at some other.
When it's in operation, that's the only time. Why be there otherwise?
So she likes the smell of toner?
I think it's the noise.
Okay.
It's the movement as well, but it's
Yeah.
still better than keyboard.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Although one day my cat really jammed up my printer. It took me a little while to get that thing unjammed. I had paper in the back, paper in the front, and I was not real friendly with my cat at that time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
understand.
I don't know what my cat did one time. I had to actually take it into Apple. She was on the keyboard and I don't know what all she did. It was unusable. So she jammed it up.
Yeah. If that is she's lovely, but I can certainly understand the frustration.
So your cat in Canada, does it have to get a COVID injection to come back into the States or what?
No, it's just that somebody has to get it, and so Alicia's mom was going to bring it down in April of 2020 when we were going to have the several months late celebration of our marriage, and then when the borders closed up, the kitty was stuck. So
Okay, there's David. Okay.
So once it becomes easy to get in and out of Canada, we'll go pick up a number of things, including Mabel.
We have a continuing series on this Sabbath school regarding the welfare of cats. It comes up mostly every week, so that's a good thing. And we look forward to seeing your cat come here from Canada, Gary. That's quite an investment, I think, in a cat. And I couldn't help but notice that one of Forrest's concerns is coyotes. Coyotes seem to have a special preference for cats. And I lost a cat to coyotes at one time, and I think it's important to keep them protected from that if possible. Okay, I could not help but think of a teacher I had when I was a student at the seminary a long time ago at Andrews University, and he said in class that he thought the best thing the church could do would be to sell Loma Linda University to the University of California, Riverside for $1, and get out from under everything that's going on there. Thankfully, nobody else has had that idea too. There have been some questions about when we will return to the Centennial Complex, and Forrest and I discussed that, and we're thinking in terms of the first Sabbath in September. That's September 4. I may go down there before then and do some hosting of our program from there just to become acquainted with the new process. We will have a hybrid model so that people who have been participating from around the world can continue to do so, but we will set it up at the Centennial Complex rather than in our home here in Beaumont, California. So with that, let's turn to whatever questions and comments people have. What do you have on board for us?
So before
have Simona.
we do that, right, you had asked some questions to me, Dave.
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
and
Go ahead.
so do you want to restate those? Because those are the ones we began with.
The two that, first of all, Simona asked, how do you see the issue of academic freedom, the foundation of intellectual life at any university, and the church's idea that they should have the final word in how church-affiliated institutions should function? So it's not asking about academic freedom and its value as such, but how does one negotiate tensions between the church's commitment to a certain set of views and values and perhaps conclusions that other people reach on campus?
Yeah.
It's
And then
that,
what was the,
how do you work that out?
yeah. And then what was the other question?
What do you mean, or what should I mean by the expression present truth?
Oh, yes. Okay, great. So, great. So I'll begin by taking those. Let me first just make a couple of observations. You know, it is an immense pleasure, I should say, to be here with this group talking about this issue. And I'm really glad to be able to talk about it with Dave, who I described not so long ago as my longest standing theological and ethical interlocutor. I think I've been having conversations about issues that matter with Dave for a very long time. And as I like to remind him, he gave me much more detailed commentary on my doctoral dissertation than my advisor did. And I'm immensely grateful for that. And of course, also to be working here with Forrest, who is, some people here know, well, Forrest does, and maybe nobody else does. I once occupied Forrest's office at La Sierra. When I was working as the managing editor of Adventist Heritage, I had inherited that office from Forrest, who'd moved on to other locales. But so these are both people who are very important to me in different ways. And of course, that's true of a number of others here. So it's always great to be in this group. And because we started out in a conversational format, I didn't take the chance to emphasize that. I also want to stress that while I have to say, the book is available very, very inexpensively at Amazon, I've provided a free electronic copy that at some point Dave will be able to share with the group, so that anybody who wants to read it in that form can do so. So I just want to make sure nobody is inhibited from participating or being aware of the issues because of a lack of access to that. So I've emailed that to him.
Yes, Gary sent me the PDF to this this morning, and I will get it to you. Working with MailChimp has not been altogether easy with respect to sending things of this nature, but I will study it and figure it out and get it to you so that you can have the book in PDF form. And thank you, Gary, for making it available to us in that fashion.
Yeah. All right. So now just to think about the issues that are on the table here. So academic freedom. So I offer, I think, a general, certainly what I hope is a reasonably detailed defense of academic freedom in the third chapter of the book. I do just want to say here, I very strongly believe in academic freedom for a whole host of reasons, and I think that it would be a mistake to approach the issue of academic freedom or of expressive freedom more generally from only one angle, right? So that in a book from a few years ago on freedom of expression, I point out a range of considerations that are all relevant here, including of course, just the importance of autonomy, the role of expression in discovery, the contributions that expressive activity makes to flourishing, and a range of other things. But let me just talk about two
related matters right now with respect to academic freedom in a church context. The first is that if the church really cares about truth, then if a church, if any group cares about truth, it cannot begin with the assumption that it's got everything right. And so to assume that its convictions are entirely on target and that no opportunity for growth in understanding is possible is to confuse itself with God, right? So that comes back, I think, to the point that I tried to make earlier about truth in the material that Dave referenced, right? So, neither the church or any church officiary is God. This is one of those ways in which I'm an unequivocal Protestant. I don't think that providence somehow protects somebody from the possibility of error when speaking on important issues. And so ongoing discovery, it seems to me, is vital. And the only way ongoing discovery happens, it seems to me, is when there's conversation. And so when there's ongoing conversation, it's then possible to winnow ideas, to bring challenges to the fore, to address them, and to refine the relevant sorts of views. Also relevant here again is, as I noted earlier, the importance of sin, right? So when we recognize that we certainly, but also anybody who's in a position to exercise control over speech, over academic freedom or similar expressive activity, isn't somehow free of temptation to prop up that person's own sense of self-importance, to insulate that person against political challenges of one kind or another, to avoid the destabilizing effect of discovering things one didn't know before. Whatever the reason, sinful tendencies can lead people to suppress expression. And if we want to restrain the penchant for sin, then it's going to be important as well to have institutional designs that don't make that easy. So I think a church institution proceeds toward truth more adequately if full-fledged conversation is possible, and the effects of sin are minimized if nobody has the ability to shut down discussion. Okay, so that's briefly what I'd say with regard to academic freedom. Again, there's a bit more in the relevant chapter of the book. Present truth. So truth, it seems to me, again, is just truth. Now, there are truths that are about temporally specific things, right? At one point, it was true that Washington crossed the Delaware. At another point before that, there was no fact of the matter regarding whether Washington crossed the Delaware or not. So there are some truths that are, as it were, time-stamped. But as a general matter, I think when we talk about present truth, we have in mind two features of the sort of truth that I hope we want to affirm. The first feature is that present truth is truth that reflects our best current understanding, which may well be better than our understanding at a previous point. Also relevant is, I think, the following: that present truth is truth that we emphasize because of its particular relevance. And seems to me that was also part of the early Adventist use of that expression, the idea that there was truth for the time, not only in that we had discovered it now and perhaps hadn't been aware of it before, but also that it was particularly salient, particularly germane to the time. And so I take present truth to be to involve both of those things.
Okay, thank you. David, did you have another question, or was that?
I find both of these helpful. One, that present truth refers to our best current understanding of some matter of fact, and that secondly, it refers to that which we emphasize. Of all the things which we could emphasize, we emphasize this because of the particular circumstances we find ourselves in. That's helpful. Now, I would like to press this just a little bit, because you do say in your book that there are some things that God cannot change, that these are necessary truths. And I think that's a very important point. And you make it with respect to mathematics. I would push it further in saying that there are some truths that even God could not change about the moral life. But whether one wants to go that far is,
Oh, no, I
is a
think
different
that's
thing. But
absolutely vital. Yeah. I agree
go
with you
ahead.
112%, Dave. I mean, I think it's easy to make the point with respect to mathematics, and people see that. But of course, I think that moral truths are like mathematical truths. They're truths that reflect the way things are. Now that they have different kinds of roots, undoubtedly. But no, I think that what is true about the way it's reasonable for people to choose and to live is just a function of the way in which God has created them. And if God had created different creatures, it might be reasonable for them to do different things. But having created the creatures God has, then it's reasonable for them to choose in some ways and not in others. So.
I think this is very, very important because it erodes a very severe understanding of divine command theories of ethics, which I think can be destructive. I think divine command theories of ethics, which serve the commands serve as pedagogy, or one thing, but when they establish the rightness and wrongness of something, that I think that's a very, very troublesome thing. Okay, let's move on. I think that's it for us. Now, I would say, though, we're going to turn back to this issue of intellectual freedom, academic freedom, in a more thorough way when we talk about the whole chapter Gary devotes to that. And I do think it's a sensitive issue for which there is no permanent answer, that each case has to be negotiated in and of itself. And we need to keep in mind that schismatics, people who cause trouble, are usually in greater trouble with church than those who are heretics. It's the schismatics who get sort of leaned on by church administrators more than those who have unconventional ideas, I think. Okay, Forrest.
Okay, Simona, did you wanted to ask a further question?
Yes, please.
Please, Simona.
Yes, thank you. So I have a comment that reflects back to the beginning of the conversation. I had problem with audio, so I couldn't join. So we were talking about excellence in education because that was, I think, the basis of what we can do as an Adventist university. And as somebody who has been through university as a student and now works at one, excellence in education is something that is built, and we build reputations. And so just because we may not have it right now doesn't mean we can't have it in the future. So it's just a brief comment. The thing that has been on my mind a lot in the last few years is how did we as a church go from people who seek the truth to people who deny the facts? And I'm talking about the general population, not people who are, intellectuals who are, have certain, ability to accept that, we grow in our understanding of reality, and that this philosophy and the search for truth is the bottom of our religion, is the foundational part of it. This is how we came to be, is because we searched for something more than what was known at the time. And now we have, by and large, when I look at the membership of the church, we have become people who not only have stopped searching for the truth, we are even denying observable facts. And it is really bothering me, and I don't know how to answer this, and how can we move forward, and get back to this idea that education is important, that we can go and should go forward in searching for what is true and what is real.
Thank you for, I think, important and thoughtful concerns, so putting important, thoughtful concerns on the table. The issue of excellence, I think, is very important, and it's something that I do try to talk about in chapter 2. So, and I I hope what I say there will be a little provocative, because I think there are different angles from which we can look at excellence, different kinds of excellence we can perceive, and I think we should absolutely be committed to excellence, and there are different things that looks like for different people and different institutions. So I'll be curious to know when we come back together to talk about this, what you make of what I say there. As regards the issue of openness to truth, you know, I don't think there's anything magical to say. I think that there are people who enjoy being dissidents. And I think we find such people at the foundations of many different movements. And one of the convictions that I've reached with increasing depth of commitment over the last few years is that the same underlying psychological, social, and cultural dynamics are recognizable, whether we are talking about religious groups, political groups, groups with certain kinds of ethical concerns, probably also groups with certain kinds of, just intellectual commitments of one kind or another, scientific commitments. We see the same dynamics in play. New groups are founded by people who like being dissidents, people who aren't made uncomfortable by that, but actually relish the chance to shake things up. And to the extent that these groups continue to be driven by various kinds of ideological concerns, they will tend to be, a favorite word of mine, fissiparous. They will tend, that is, to be fissile, to engage in fission. They will continue to split because people continue to disagree. And I think this relates very much to what Dave said about schismatics versus heretics, that it's the people right next to you who don't quite see things the same way, who are particularly objectionable and whom you want to push away. I think that's just the dynamic. And so we end up with a situation, I think, in which people are deeply emotionally invested in maintaining the current state of affairs. It always sort of amuses me when a critic of religious belief like Richard Dawkins announces enthusiastically that, while religious people are invested in what they believe, those who embrace the sort of atheism that he endorses, are just interested in thinking about things rationally. It's absurd. The reality is people for whom views become identity constitutive, as they certainly do for religious people, but also for people of all sorts of ideological stripes, it becomes very hard to let go of those beliefs. I think that's just the reality of the case. And it's not probably something that we should be unduly judgmental about, because I think it's a characteristic we all have. So I think, we certainly need to be aware of the temptation to avoid truth because it's unsettling. We recognize that for all sorts of reasons, it can be deeply unsettling. And probably the best way for us to deal with that is to try, at any rate, to favor an institutional architecture, an institutional ecology that really does allow for ongoing challenges so that the weight of argument, evidence, and social impact can tend to undermine beliefs that turn out not to be sustainable. And while we do that, I think we have to recognize and respond with compassion to the tendency to resist change, because it can be so unsettling to convictions on which we have grounded our identities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I thought I saw Dr. Bull, but I must be confused here. I'm going to go to you, Peter.
Or don't forget me.
Oh, you do have a question.
Yeah, I decided that I do have a question.
You didn't? Okay, I'm going to go to Peter first, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter.
I mean,
You're there. We hear you.
just a second. Thank you, Gary, for your presentation. From some materials that I read, I understood that it's practically this idea that universities are somehow in crisis, universities in the United States. And this may be related to the way in free expression of ideas and other things that universities are promoting these days. And in connection with the materials that they've recommended for preparations for today, I understood that basically from Paul Newman and from Yaroslav Pelikan, to quote only two of them, the purpose of the university is to provide knowledge, to help the students to acquire knowledge, and also for a moral fiber, for morally educating them. But among the universities in the United States today, I've noticed the tendency not doing that anymore, but most of it to indoctrinate the students. And I'd like you to comment if you see any danger in that, and what is the danger in instead of helping the students to acquire knowledge and to have a fiber, moral fiber formation for them, to indoctrinate them in a certain direction with some certain purpose, certain ideas.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Always good to hear from you. So, first of all, just a brief comment about Cardinal Newman and something that Dave said earlier that I failed to pick up on at the time. It seems to me that it's certainly right that, as Dave notes, that Newman's interested in knowledge and moral education and isn't concerned so much with research. The reality is, of course, that the rise of the research university is a very recent development. It's really a development that's occurred over the past 150 years, and Newman was writing kind of on the edge of that. And of course, it obviously had been the case at places like Oxford, where Newman taught before he became Catholic. That indeed, serious intellectual activity was taking place, but certainly, it wasn't until the dominance of the German model that really came to be seen as an independent contribution of the university, rather than as a kind of side effect, I think, of what was going on earlier. Clearly, again, it was happening much earlier. You think about the way in which serious intellectual work gets done very early on in the late Middle Ages out of universities and so forth. But it certainly wouldn't have been seen as central to the same degree that it is now. So that's not, of course, Peter, what you were focusing on. I just thought about that in connection with the reference to Newman. So I get nervous, I think, when we try to generalize about what's going on in as big a world as the world of higher education. And I sometimes think that the Jeremiahs and the Cassandras who tell us that higher education in the United States is falling apart often have in mind developments at a small number of elite institutions that can probably in one way or another afford to engage in some kind of buffoonery of a sort that's really not realistically possible at other institutions, and that have students who are often from very economically secure backgrounds, who can again afford to focus on issues that would not be primary concerns for students at most institutions. So I wouldn't want to generalize, I think, from some of the horror stories that we hear about higher education in the United States. I wouldn't want to generalize some stories that are concerned with events at a small number of institutions that really are statistical outliers. Wouldn't want us to think that somehow portended the demise of higher education. So that's the first thing I'd want to say. The second thing I'd want to say is that I think indoctrination is probably on one level unavoidable. That is, people have convictions and they share those convictions. And of course, religiously oriented institutions are often challenged precisely because it is seen as objectionable that they're engaged in indoctrination. And I think one thing that's useful that Chuck Scriven has emphasized over time, and that in a different way, the very, very gifted philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre has underscored, is that one contribution that a university or a college can make to the wider intellectual conversation is precisely by being self-aware of its particular identity and pressing that identity, working on the implications of that identity and of its underlying convictions. In Christian higher education in the United States, this has probably been especially the work of folks in the Reformed tradition. I have many objections to things that folks in the Reformed tradition have said over the years, but I think there's been a tremendously exciting and vibrant work on the part of Christian institutions of higher education in the Reformed tradition by way of emphasizing what Christian convictions look like when played out in the context of intellectual life, and really stressed in the work of the college or university. And so, of course, we think especially of Calvin College in Grand Rapids, but certainly other institutions as well have done great work here. So I think an institution doesn't do anybody any favors if it simply hides its light under a bushel. Now, on the other hand, indoctrination can suggest a matter of ignoring academic freedom by, as it were, penalizing students because they come to or express the wrong views. And that certainly is a deeply troubling notion, a notion that somehow we've got the truth and we're going to suppress your expressions of dissent. Or if faculty members are silenced because they don't line up with the majority of in one way or another. So I think academic freedom remains absolutely vital and counts against a certain kind of indoctrination. But if we're simply concerned about an institution proudly affirming its identity and exploring the implications of its convictions, then I think that's important. So what I think needs to happen in higher education generally, and in Christian institutions particularly, and especially Adventist institutions, is on the one hand, I would say, a lack of insecurity, a lack of concern about being serious about underlying convictions and affirming them, but on the other hand, a reaffirmed commitment to academic freedom that allows both students and colleagues to disagree vigorously without being suppressed. And so in that sense, a kind of deep resistance to a certain kind of indoctrination. We absolutely ought to be concerned with moral character. I think we address the issue of moral character, again, not through hectoring lectures or paternalistic disciplinary policies, but by modeling a certain kind of flourishing life for active imitation. And we absolutely want to affirm with Newman the importance of knowledge. Again, not, I think, by forcing a particular version of knowledge down anybody's throat, but by embracing an institutional ecology that allows for vigorous conversation from which greater insight can emerge.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, McKinley.
Thank you very much, Forrest. I will make sure to contribute to the till. Okay.
You want me to spell my name for you? So you can...
Yes, and the bank account. Thank you for the information you shared, Dr. Chartier, in the dialogue with Dr. Larson. The book is timely. I look forward to reading it, not in the least because I'm working on a secret project that ideas in the book could potentially inform. So thank you again for writing the book.
Of course.
A few observations on the dialogue with Dr. Larson, but first, let me say something about the research university. I like the idea of the research university because it helps shape the research agenda on the important innovations of the day that frame the future. I think about it particularly from my perspective in terms of energy and medicine and so on and so forth. Now my observations. I like the verbs that were used in the summary Dr. Larson read. Those verbs resonate very much. I'm not going to go over them, but I guess those of us still in the group can reflect on those summaries. On prayer and providence and intercession, here are my thoughts. My sense is that the relationship with God is collaborative and cooperative. And God invites his people to participate in that framework. Those who are aware of this framework can leverage it consistent with God's purposes to the great benefit of others. And in fact, this morning, I spent some time looking at this idea, and I think it's supported by a rich data set. You may be aware or familiar with reports of George Mueller's 50,000 documented answered prayers. When new knowledge concepts are applied, that data set can be amplified to over 1.8 million unique pieces of data, which lends itself to a ton of analysis. So that's my first observation on prayer. The second thing I want to comment on is this idea of truth and objective truth. Whenever I hear that there is no objective truth or something to that effect, the engineer in me gets back to many of our fundamental laws, like the definition of work. Work is equals to force times distance. Some of Newton's laws of motion, the laws of thermodynamics. Isn't it possible that they claim that there is no objective truth and overstatement? So those are my two observations, comments with questions for you to respond to.
All right, well, I again want to emphasize absolutely that that it seems to me that part of belief in the reality of God, I think that's tied up deeply with the belief that there is mind-independent truth about all sorts of stuff, and I think. On the one hand, we have people making one sort of error when they suggest that there is no such thing as mind-independent truth, and we find that on the in certain kinds of fashionable views embraced by people. I would say, as a general matter, people who are not people who have really thought through the philosophical issues themselves would have picked up some buzz phrases from the philosophers while themselves operating in kind of allied disciplines and perhaps not completely understanding the more subtle points the philosophers are making. I think very few philosophers would really want to just dismiss truth in that way. The other challenge, though, I think is equally infuriating. So I absolutely want to reject relativism and perspectivism and nihilism as accounts of truth. I think we want to affirm the reality of truth. We want to affirm what is the case and what God knows as a challenge to, as a corrective to, whatever we might think. On the other hand, I think we've got people who claim that relativism or perspectivism or what they think they know what they mean when they call postmodernism is being invoked to destroy truth when people just disagree with them. And I confess I find that deeply frustrating and sometimes infuriating. So, if somebody says, for instance, said in the early 2000s that, the United States government was engaged in imperial mischief in the Middle East, you could count on some political commentator assuring you that indeed you were guilty of moral unclarity and you failed to understand the important moral distinctions between the forces of evil and the forces of good, with the thought that the U.S. government somehow represented the forces of good. And you get this more recently, I think, in various kinds of moral debates. So if somebody says says, no, that view isn't right. That view about some controversial moral question isn't right. Here's why. The response very frequently is, oh, you're just a relativist. You don't care about truth. With the implication being, as far as I can tell, that truth just is whatever you happen to already believe. And so when instead somebody challenges that, that person is doing so in the name of relativism. No, that person is challenging that precisely in the name of truth, precisely because it's not right that, well, I won't pick any examples here to kind of increase the level of controversy unnecessarily, but
Yes.
I just think the reality is true. It's precisely in the name of truth that we ought to refuse to remain content with whatever happens to be on the table right now. So I think we're due to be out at 12:30, and we're almost there. So I think that gives me an excuse to stop talking at this point.
But before you exercise that privilege, maybe next time you can comment on my observation about prayer, which I think is an important point. And then I'll let Dr. Larson and Forrest, unless Forrest wants me to give him more money to continue the answer.
I can be bought.
Good to know.
Well, Dr. Larson, what do you folks say? Are you going to end at 12:30, or should Dr. Chartier go on to the prayer thing?
You're muted, David. David, you're muted.
How many more people do you have online?
Just our person in witness protection, McKinley.
Okay. Well, one quick question maybe from we can get a response from Gary, and that is one of our colleagues out in Hawaii says that he worships at an Adventist church right next door to the University of Hawaii, but there seems to be very little interest on the part of that congregation to connect with even the Adventist students at the University of Hawaii. And he was wondering if you have some idea of why that indifference is the case.
No, is the short answer. I really don't, because I don't know the details about the what's going on at in the congregation. I don't know where the congregation draws its members from, what its history with past attempts to engage with the university and so forth might be. As a general matter, of course. I mean, you could come up with a sort of stereotype, right? A stereotype that, well, the university just seems like a very alien place. We really don't know what to say about what's going on there. The Adventist students there, I suppose, are engaged in their sort of Adventist version of the, Amish Rumspringa. They're off doing what they do, and they're not really engaged with the congregation. Well, we're not going to force ourselves on them. And since we don't really know what to say anyway, I guess we won't, right? I mean, I really can't be sure what's going on there. And it may just be that people in the congregation haven't thought about it. On the other hand, somebody may have raised the idea, and they may just have felt like, we don't really know that we have the sort of, intellectual resources to be helpful to those students and so forth. I certainly think that an active attempt to reach out to the students, to let them know that they're welcome, would be a great thing. On the other hand, obviously, I don't know what the experience of engaging with the congregation would be like for the students. I don't know what they would find if they all came to the congregation. What would that experience be like? I don't know. So if you're going to actively seek them out and try to welcome them, then the flip side is you have to make sure that there's a place that's going to be genuinely welcoming for them.
Okay, that's helpful. My guess is that relationship between the congregation and the university is not true just there. I've often thought about the congregation at Berkeley, California, and how sometimes it's reached out to the university students, but other times it's been quite indifferent to them. Now, McKinley wonders if we will keep going. I think we will conclude now formally, but I will leave the session open for those who want to converse informally. But we also also recognize that Gary may have other commitments, and that at 12:30 he's done all that he has promised to do for us. And if he has to move on, that will be fine. Okay, here's the benediction. And thank you, Gary, once again for being with us. It's been a pleasure and very informative. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
So, Dr. Chartier, are you going to indulge me, or are you going to
I'm going to be back
Okay.
in a few weeks, but for now, I think I'll be checking out.
All right. Thank you very much. Keep my question about prayer in your mind.
Okay.
All right. Dave, are you getting off too?